When I say the word apple, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Maybe you think of the fruit, or maybe you think of your phone or your laptop. As a web developer, when I hear the word Apple, one of the first things I think of is beautiful, dynamic, interactive websites. One thing that has always stood out to me about Apple's websites is their 3D scroll animations. As I'm scrolling, their products are rotating around, opening up, dancing around the page. It really draws me in as a user, and I want to keep scrolling and keep reading. Now, at first glance, this might seem like it's quite hard to do, but actually, I'm going to show you that it's not. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how you can add Apple-style 3D scroll animations to your Next.js site using React 3 Fiber and GSAP. By the end of this video, you'll learn how to make this awesome product page where we have a MacBook that's opening up, sliding across the screen from side to side, and text that is fading in and out in sync with the model. Now, 3D web development may seem daunting at first, especially with all the underlying math involved. Thankfully, there's a lot of really great resources out there that help break down these topics and make them easier to understand regardless of your skill level. One resource which I personally recommend is Brilliant.org, who is the sponsor of today's video. Brilliant is a learning platform where you learn by doing rather than reading through some boring textbook or staring at a YouTube video for 45 minutes and not remembering what it was about. They have thousands of interactive lessons in math, AI, data analysis, and more. Their course on vectors alone has over 22 lessons, which starts from the very basics on what a vector is to more advanced topics like rotation, reflections, and handling different coordinate systems. The lessons take on a first principles approach, which helps you build understanding from the ground up. Each lesson is filled with hands-on problem solving that lets you play with the concepts, a method proven to be 6 times more effective than watching lecture videos. Plus, all content on Brilliant is crafted by an award-winning team of researchers, teachers, and professionals from MIT, Caltech, Duke, Microsoft, Google, and more. To try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/dangreenhick or scan the QR code on screen, or you can click the link in the description. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription, so check it out today. So this is our starting point that we're going to be building off of. We have sort of a blank canvas, just kind of a skeleton of a product page. I have a little sticky nav header at the top, and we have our hero section, which will be showing our laptop, kind of looking at the top of it. And then as we scroll down, we'll go down to the first kind of marketing section here, and that's when that laptop will open up and will slide to the right and be facing the user right over here. And then as we scroll down again, we go to some more marketing text, and then our laptop is going to rotate and slide over to the left side of the screen. So let's go look at the source code for this really quick just to see what we're working with. So here's the code for our Next.js app. It's pretty straightforward. It's not a whole lot more than what comes with the standard template. I've just defined this root layout here, and I've actually used v0.dev to create this layout for me. So I didn't even do this by myself. I had AI help out with this. So if you're looking to get kind of a usable template to start with, I suggest trying v0.dev or trying out ChatGPT to help you out. Saves a lot of time in the long run. So it's very straightforward layout. We have some of our navigation links here. And then we have our child pages. Right now we only have one page, and that is our home page here. You can see I have the different sections defined. We have the hero section here with some text inside of it. We have our first section that talks about the Retina display. And then we have one more section that talks about top of class performance. And that's really it. That's all that is in our app right now. What we're going to need to do is set up another component that our 3D scene is going to live inside of. And then we'll load our 3D model inside of that. And then we'll start to set up some of the animations. We'll also trigger off of the scroll position of the mouse, and we'll be using GSAP for that. GSAP is a really powerful library that allows us to hook into scroll events. So aside from moving our 3D model around and rotating it, we're also going to be fading text in and out. You'll be learning how to manipulate 3D elements on the page as well as HTML elements. So you can pretty much do anything once you learn those two things. Now, before we can get a 3D model onto our page, we need a 3D model that we can put on that page. So I went to cgtrader.com. That's one of many websites you can find 3D models on. If you're working on adding one of your own products, you may already have 3D models. Some other alternatives are Sketchfab and TurboSquid. A lot of these are paid models, but you will find some free models like this one here. So this is from our Zook. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. So this is free. I just clicked on the free download button and downloaded the Blender file. Now you will need to create a free account on CGTrader if you want to get assets from here, but it is a free account and all you need to do is link your Google account. Now once you click on that download button and you wait about 20 seconds, it's going to take you to this page where it lists out the files to download. Now you can see it has the zip file of the textures, which are the images, so like the screen and the letters on the buttons. Those are all images that are laid onto the 3D model. And it also has DAE, FBX, and OBJ files, which are all different types of 3D files, different file extensions. The one I'm interested in here is the blend file. And this is a file for a 3D editing program called Blender. Now, if you're doing any kind of 3D web development, you're going to need to learn Blender at some point. Blender is one of the most widely used 3D editing programs, so you'll have no shortage of great documentation and resources to learn that. Now, I went ahead and opened that file in Blender. One of the things that I wanted to do was to make sure that the model was split into two parts. The top part, which is the screen, and the bottom part, which is the keyboard. I wanted to be able to move these parts independently of each other, and luckily the model was already set up in a way where the top and bottom were separated. The only work I really needed to do here was to align the hinge of the screen at the origin of the scene. And that just makes it a lot easier when I'm rotating the screen that I know it's going to rotate right on that hinge point. I also folded the screen down so the laptop was sort of in a closed position, since this is going to be the starting point for my model when I'm viewing it on the page. Now, I know I'm glossing over a lot of details here with Blender, but like I said, there's a lot to Blender that really warrants a separate tutorial, and there's already lots of great tutorials out there. And the workflow for each 3D model is just going to be a little bit different, so what I might be doing here may not be useful for what you're trying to do. Now, the one important part that you need to know, and this applies to whatever type of 3D model that you're doing, is exporting the model so it can be used in your Next.js app. So to do that, we go to File, we go down to Export, and you click on GLTF 2.0. And in here, make sure you pick the format is GLTF binary. And then under these other options, you can check some other settings as well. We don't have any animation in here. We're going to be doing the animation in our app, so we can uncheck that. You can also change things like what parts of our model are exported, what's the image quality of our textures. But really, you can leave these as the defaults and just export this. So I'm back in VS Code now, and I've actually exported two different 3D models, one for the top of the MacBook and one for the bottom of the MacBook. Now I could have integrated those into one and found the separate parts within that model, but this way I just found it a little bit easier to have separate models for the top and the bottom. Now I've placed those under the assets folder in the public directory, and now we're ready to go ahead and start writing some code. So we need to install some of the dependencies that we'll be using for some of our 3D libraries and GSAP. So let's go take a look at the package.json since I've already installed these dependencies. And you can see that I have React 3 Dry, which is a helper library for React 3 Fiber. And this is the core React 3 Fiber library. Now, if you're not familiar with React 3 Fiber is sort of think of it as like a wrapper or a layer on top of Three.js. Now, if you're brand new to 3D, I highly recommend doing a little bit with Three.js before you dive into React 3 Fiber, just so you know what React 3 Fiber is doing under the hood. And really, you just have to do a couple demo apps, see how the applications are set up. I actually have some videos, which I'll link in the description below, which are a really good starting point if you're brand new to Three.js. So don't worry if you're new to all this. So back in our package.json file, you can see we have these two React 3 Fiber libraries installed. Now, at the time of this video, Next.js 15 and React 19 are quite new, so I'm using some release candidate libraries here, but obviously use whatever libraries match the versions that you need. Next, we install the Three.js library. So even though we are using React 3 Fiber, we are still using Three.js under the hood, so we need that dependency as well. And finally, I've installed the corresponding types library for Three.js to get IntelliSense in VS Code. And finally, I've installed the GSAP library here, and we'll be using this for our scroll animations. Now to get started here, let's create a simple component that is going to hold our 3D scene, and we'll just get a rotating cube up on the screen first. And later on, we'll import our MACBOOK model, and then we'll get to the animations after that. So in my components library, I'm going to create a new file called scene, capital S, TSX, and also create my index file for exporting these components. Now this is going to be a client component. It's running in the browser, and let's export our scene function, and then we'll just return a div here. Now we want the 3D scene to take up the entire screen really. So I'm going to make this a fixed component. So I'll do class name, and let's make this fixed. And then we'll set an inset of 0 so it fills the entire screen. And then within this, I'm going to need a canvas. And this is part of the React 3 Fiber library. Now this canvas is really just a DOM element, which we can pass our Three.js elements into. And the React 3 Fiber and React 3 Fiber Dry libraries just provide a lot of helpers that allow us to really easy and declaratively add components underneath this. So in order to view our 3D scene and convert 3D world into 2D world, we're going to need a camera. And we define that camera on the canvas element here. So we'll set camera equal to an object, and then we'll set the position to say x of 0, y of 0, z of 5. That'll just pull the camera away from the origin a little bit so we can actually see our object. And then we'll do a field of view of 60 degrees. Now it's complaining that we don't have any children yet for our canvas, so let's go ahead and define a box. And this is just a basic box model, comes with React 3 Dry. Now this is about the most basic 3D scene that we can make, so this is a good time to test things out and make sure that they're working. So we've exported our scene here, and in the index file in our component directory, we need to make sure that we are exporting the scene there as well. And then finally, back on our home page here, at the very top within our main section, I'm going to add it above our hero section here. So the 3D models rendered underneath our content, I'm going to add in that scene component. Now, if we go check out our web page, we can see that we have our cube rendered in the screen. And since we used fixed positioning, as we scroll, that cube is scrolling with the rest of the content. Now, just as a quick little exercise, let's try and get this cube to rotate. Even though we're not going to be doing any kind of per frame rotation, we're going to be doing rotation based off the scroll position. It's still good to see how it works in React. So going back into our scene, I'm just going to create a new function here. I'm not going to export this one. And let's call this test box. And this function is going to return our box. Now, in order to get our box to rotate each frame, I need to get a reference to it and then update the rotation on that reference. So I'm going to create a box reference here, and I can do that using the useRef hook. So this is going to be of type 3.mesh, and I need to import the Three.js library before I can use 3. So I'm just going to import the whole library as 3, and then we'll just initialize this to a null value. And then within our box itself, we can set the ref equal to our box ref. Now I want to update the rotation each frame. So I'm going to use the use frame hook that comes with React 3 Fiber. This just accepts a callback. So we can do box ref. We'll get the current reference and then we'll rotate it about its y-axis. So the y-axis is the up and down axis. So you can think of that as me kind of rotating around in my chair. Now this might be null. So we first need to do a null check. And there we go. Now when we go back to our page, we can see that we have a rotating cube. Now it looks a little funny because there's no lighting yet. So let's go ahead and add some lighting and some materials that support lighting. Now back in our scene, I'm going to add a directional light. And I'm going to set the intensity of this to, let's say 2. The default intensity of 1 is just not very bright in my opinion, so I always tweak this value a bit. And then we need to set the position of the light, which is actually the direction. I know that's a little bit confusing, but that's just how it is. So we'll set this to something different in each axis. We'll just do 1, 2, 3. And then we'll close out that tag. Now, if we look at our box right away, we still don't see any shading on it, and that's because it's using a basic material, which does not support lighting. So we need a material that does support lighting. And that's very easy to add. All we have to do is go inside of our box component, and I'm going to add a mesh standard material. And let's set the color of this to red. And we'll just leave that like that. Add some parentheses here. All right. Now when we go back in, we can see that we have our shaded cube. It's rotating. And we have the basics of our React 3 Fiber scene up and running. So while red cubes are all fun and interesting, I think it's time we add our MacBook model in and start making this look a bit more like an Apple website. So going back to our code, rather than using our test box here, I'm going to create a new component that's going to represent our MacBook. So in our components directory, let's create a new file called MacBook TSX. And let's start by creating a new function called MacBook. And right away, I'm going to import the Three.js library. So importing 3D models into our app is actually super easy and it can be done in one line only. So let's go ahead and create 2 new variables. We'll call one top model. And in order to import our 3D model, we have to use the use GLTF hook, which comes with React 3 Dry. And then we need to give it the path in our public directory. So that would be /assets /MacBook top.glb. And then likewise, we'll import the model for the bottom half, and we'll do MacBook bottom here. Now I would like to group both of the top and the bottom model into one element here. So let's return, and then I'm going to create a group element. And within this, I'm going to have a mesh. And then the mesh kind of represents the geometry and the material together as one. So we already have the geometry and material for our 3D models kind of wrapped up into these variables here. And we can pass those into our mesh by using something called primitive. Now within our primitive, we need to reference our model, and we do that by setting the object property equal to top model. And then we want to access the nodes of the model that contains our 3D asset. And then we need to reference the name of the model. Now in Blender, I called my models top and bottom. So here I will just do nodes.top. And then I'm going to Copy and paste this, and I'm going to do the same for our bottom model. So this will be bottom model dot nodes dot bottom. Now just remember, this will need to be whatever you name this in Blender. Now going back to our scene, let's go ahead and delete our test box component. Don't need that anymore. I think I'm going to keep these dependencies for now. It's going to throw some errors, but we should still be able to build. Let's replace this with our MacBook component we just created. So that should be all that we need to view our MacBook and our app now. So let's go back to the browser, and sure enough, we have our MacBook there. Now it looks like we're looking at the back of it where the hinge is, which isn't exactly what we want. So we need to start setting the initial position in, rotation, and size of our MacBook model. So it appears that we're looking directly at the Apple logo on the top of the laptop. Now it might be a bit confusing knowing which way is which direction is the x-axis, which is the y. So there's a helpful helper that comes with, I believe it's React 3 Dry. So let's look for axes helper, and we'll add that in. And I'm going to give this a scale of 2. And then one other thing I'm going to do just for debugging is in our page, I'm going to move our scene all the way to the bottom so that it sits in front of all of these sections on the page. And then we'll add something else here called orbit controls. And you'll see what this does in a second. And this comes with the Dry library. Now I can rotate our laptop around, and you can see that it might be a little difficult to see depending on what type of screen you're looking at here, but there's these axes as well. So there's this, because it's yellow or red depending on where you look at it. There's a green and a blue. So the yellow/red corresponds to the x-axis. So that's pointing left to right, right being the positive direction. The green axis is y, so the positive direction is up, and the z-axis is blue. So the positive direction is kind of facing out of the screen. And if you remember, we set our camera to a z of 5, so that makes sense. We kind of pushed ourselves out of the screen 5 units, so the laptop is sitting in front of us. So I want the laptop to look like this on the screen. So that means I need to rotate it about the x-axis here by 90 degrees. So let's go into our MacBook here. And on the entire group itself, let's set the rotation. And this is going to be an array of 3 values. These are the rotations in radians around each axis. So radians is just a different angle measure if you're not familiar with it. So 360 degrees is equal to 2 times pi radians. And pi is around 3.14. So 2 times 3.14 is 6.28. You don't need to remember all the decimals. All we need to do is remember that if 2 times pi is 360 degrees, then pi is 180 degrees, and pi divided by 2 is 90 degrees. So I think I said the x-axis here, so let's rotate math.pi divided by 2. And do a quick reload of the page. So there we have our MacBook is now facing the correct direction. I want to set the position as well. It's kind of a bit high. So position, let's set the Y to -0.7. See how that looks. And there, it's a bit more centered on the page now. I think we could make it a little bit bigger. So let's set the scale property. So the scale, we can scale the entire thing if we just pass a scalar value in. So I'll do, let's say 1.3. So it'll be 130% bigger than it normally is. And there, that looks nice and big now. So that is looking good. I'm going to go ahead and move the scene on our page back to the top here because this prevents things from scrolling. And then we'll go ahead and remove the orbit controls. I'm still going to keep the axes in. That'll help later on. And there we go. Now as we scroll, the MacBook is kind of scrolling with the page. So now that we have our 3D model loaded, I think now's as good a time as any as we can start hooking up these scroll animations using GSAP. So going back into our code, let's first work on the scroll animations for our 3D model for the MacBook, and then we'll move on and we'll do the scroll animations to make the text fade in and out. So I'm going to close this sidebar for now. So we'll start by importing our GSAP dependencies. I think I can get rid of this Three.js dependency here. Doesn't seem like we're using that. So first let's import GSAP from GSAP, and then the GSAP plugin that we'll be using is the scroll trigger. So we'll import that from GSAP scroll trigger. And then the first thing that you need to do is you need to register the plugin with GSAP. So we will pass in scroll trigger here. So that handles the importing and the registration process. So now we can go ahead and use that plugin. Now we're going to be manipulating properties of our meshes. We're going to be modifying their position, their rotation, their scale. So we need references to 3 different things. The entire MacBook itself, which is this group. So any position, rotation, scale will be applied to both the top and the bottom part of our laptop at the same time. And then we want to be able to move the top lid, kind of open that up independently of the bottom. So we'll need a separate reference for that. So let's start by creating, let's just do 3 variables at the top here. And then let's go ahead and set the refs on each of these. So this will be group ref. Our mesh will be top ref and bottom ref. So setting up these animations is actually really easy once you get the hang of it. There's a little bit of syntax you need to figure out, but it's a very, I would say, practical system. When you write it out, it really makes sense. It's easy to read. It's very clear what animations are happening in what order. So we start by setting up a timeline. So we'll do GSAP timeline. Now we need to pass in some variables here. So our timeline is going to be basically a sequence of different actions that are going to happen over time. But rather than happening with time, it's going to happen with scroll position. So we are using the scroll trigger. There's just a few properties we need to set up here. Now, before we define these, it's helpful if we kind of go back here and look at the layout of our HTML document. So let's look under the main section here. So remember, we have our hero image. So just to make it a bit easier to see, let's make the background red for our hero section. We'll make the background blue for section 1. And then for section 2, we'll make the background green. So you can see that as we scroll through, of course, we have these different sections that are kind of scrolling up and being hidden. And this is what we're going to be keying off of. So we're going to be looking at the top edge of our first section here. And once that breaches the bottom of the screen here, once you see a little bit of blue, that's when we want our animation to start. We want to start rotating that laptop into place. And then we want the animation to end when this line where the blue and the red meet reaches the top of the screen. That's going to be our end state. And then we're going to create a separate timeline for when we go from section 2 to section 3. I should say section 1 to section 2, sorry. So same thing, once this blue-green line pops up above the bottom of the screen, that kicks off that next animation. So we're going to rotate the laptop, let's see, 90 degrees, it'll be counterclockwise. And then we're going to slide it over to the left side of the screen. So we'll be setting up two different timelines. We'll be focusing on the timeline from our hero section to section 1 with this first timeline. So our trigger is going to be a selector for the element that we're going to trigger off of, and that's going to be section 1. And we're going to start the animation when the top of section 1 reaches the bottom of the screen. And we're going to end the animation when the top of section 1 reaches the top of the screen. Now finally, we're going to set the scrub property to true, and this is just going to set up smooth scrolling. And that works really nice on like a MacBook trackpad. When you have that really smooth scrolling, it gives you a very smooth animation. So we've finished setting up our timeline. We've set the element that we're triggering off of, and we've set the start and end conditions for our scrolling. Now we need to control what happens in between this. So when we scroll in between these two values, what is going to change? And there's a very clear syntax for doing this. So we do .to, and then we need to set our target. So in this case, we're no longer targeting our HTML element. We are targeting the thing that we want to animate. So first I want to animate the X rotation of our MacBook. So let's do group ref. We'll get the current value of that reference, and then we're going to be modifying the rotation. Now this needs to be an object, and then we're going to control which properties we want to animate on that object. Now we've run into a bit of a wrinkle here because we're dealing with these references that may not exist until the DOM is completely mounted and loaded. So we need to wrap this in a use effect. So we'll put all that inside of there. And then before we run the effect, we can check to see if our references are null or not. So if group ref or top ref or bottom ref are null, then we'll just return. We're not going to do the animation. And then we can get rid of the question mark there. And now we need to tell it what variables that we want to tween. And tweening is just another way of saying animation. So this takes in an object, and we want to control the X rotation. And we need to give that a target value. So let's see, we're at math pi over 2. I guess I'll just say pi over 2, 90 degrees when we start. So let's set this to just pi. And then we need to tell GSAP how we want to move from that start rotation, 90 degrees, to the end rotation. And that's set with a property called easing, or ease. Now the most common easing is quadratic. Don't need to know what that means, but power to and out is a great one to use by default. Just gives a very smooth animation where the beginning and the end of the animation are kind of slowed down a bit. This gives sort of like an accelerated profile of the animation. You'll see what I mean in a minute. Looks like I made a mistake here. These should not be the references themselves. We need to make sure that the value of the reference is not null. So this is all we really need to do to animate the rotation of our laptop. So let's go to the browser. And now as I scroll down, you should expect that animation to start. And when I reach the end of section 1, then the animation should stop. So as you can scroll, you can see that the rotation starts off kind of slow. That's that easing kicking in. And it kind of accelerates, and then it slows down as we reach the end here. Now I'm going to go back. Let's see, let's go into our code here. I'm going to set these background colors to make this a bit easier to see. So for section 1, let's do a background of, let's pick a random color here. Let's do red 200. And then for section 2, we'll do a background of blue 200. Don't want to do the full red or blue and it'll burn our eyes out. And let's see, I want my MacBook to sit in front of that for now. So let's move this scene to the bottom of this. Right there we go. So you can see that right as the top of section 1 reaches the top of the screen, that is when the animation ends. But if I scroll back, it'll play the animation in reverse. And if I scroll this on my MacBook, you can see it's much silkier smooth. Looks very nice. Of course, with the mouse, I get some discrete scrolling, so it doesn't look as good. But it does look like it's rotating in the wrong direction here. So what I want to do with this for this first transition is I want to have the laptop kind of fall flat down, rotate around to face the camera, and then I want it to open up. So there's a couple different things we need to do there. So let's start working on that. So I'm setting this to 180 degrees. I'm going to set it to 0 degrees. And then there, our laptop now rotates in the direction I want it to. And then we need to do a rotation around the y-axis. Now we can either have both rotations happen simultaneously, or we can have them happen independently. I'll show you both and how to do that. So let's just copy this rotation. And let's do the y-axis instead. So we need to rotate it 180 degrees. We'll do math pi. And there's one other thing I want to set within this little animation block here. So right after this curly brace, I'm going to set the animation position, and I'm going to do this less than sign. And this looks a bit mysterious right now. I'll show you what that means in a second. So let's go here and see how this animation looks first. So as I scroll down now, you can see that both of the animations are happening simultaneously. So the laptop is kind of folding down, and it's also doing that 180 degree spin. So that looks pretty cool. Obviously it's a bit too big, we'll fix that. So now if I change this to a greater than sign, what is that going to do? So note that I'm applying that to the Y rotation, not the X rotation. So now as I scroll, we can see that first it does the X axis rotation, and then it does the Y axis rotation afterwards. So instead of them happening together, it makes them happen in sequence. And that's what this animation position property controls. What it means when you do less than is I want this animation to start at the same time as the previous animation. Now if I set this to greater than, that means I want this animation to start after this animation has already completed. So starting it at the end of this one. So that's a really powerful thing that allows you to kind of either sequence separate animations or combine them together in unique ways. Now I kind of prefer the animations happening in sequence. I think it looks a bit better that way because the laptop's not kind of like rotating to the side. So we're going to leave it where this animation happens second. Now the next two things we need to fix are the position and the scale. So you can tell that when we're rotating down here, it's too big. And we also want to offset things a little bit to the right, so in the positive X direction. So we need to add 2 more animation blocks to this timeline. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy this. So we need to set the position. That's going to be the X position. So let's try moving it by 1.5 units. And I want this to happen at the start of this animation. So we'll do a less than sign. And then for the scale, I want to set scale uniformly in all directions. Let's do like 0.8. Let's remember we're starting at 1.3. So it'll be about a 30-40% reduction in the scale. And this one will also happen at the same time as the position. And let's see what this looks like. So now as we scroll down, it's a bit hard to see, but I can tell it's getting a little smaller. So it looks like it's going to the right a bit too much. So we may need to tweak these properties a bit to get them just right. But I won't bore you with me going through the process of tweaking. That's not very exciting. But one thing I do want to show you how to do is how we can animate this lid opening up. So let's work on that as well. You guessed it, we just need to set up another animation block in our timeline. So let's see, I think we can have this happen right after our Y rotation. So we'll do the top ref rotation, and we'll set the X rotation to, let's just guess and do 90 degrees. Now when I scroll down, first it's going to fall down flat and then it'll rotate. You can see that screen opening up. That looks pretty cool. Looks like our lights are a little bit dim, so we may need to tweak that. Also, I want the laptop to be kind of at an angle here, so we may need to not rotate it in the Y-axis so much. So I'm going to go and tweak a few of these things. All right, so I made a few tweaks to the animation. Now when I scroll, it lays down and then does that nice spin and opens up the screen. Made the lights a little bit brighter too, so that the laptop isn't quite so dark. So I'm really happy with how that animation is looking. I think that's good enough for now. Now the next thing we need to do is add a separate timeline so that when we scroll down from section 1 to section 2, it's going to shift our laptop to the left, and it's going to rotate it a little bit so the laptop is now facing these words. So for the sake of time, I've coded up the second timeline. There's really nothing any different that I did in this one. I just thought we could just walk through it, and that's a little bit faster for you. We have our first timeline up here. And for second timeline, we're now triggering off of section 2. And it's the same deal. When the top of section 2 hits the bottom of the screen, we're going to start the animation. And when the top of the section 2 hits the top of the screen, we're going to end the animation. Now there's two different things I need to do. I need to move the laptop from the right to the left of the screen. So we're doing that translation right here. And we also need a rotation. So before we were doing the Y rotation was math.pi minus 0.4. So that's around 150 degrees. So now all I did in the second timeline was just add 0.4. So just change the sign on that. So now if we go and scroll, got a nice scroll there. And then we now get that shift to the left and also the rotation. So now let's take what we learned and let's apply it to our text so that when our text is scrolling up and down on the screen, we can animate the opacity, make it look a little bit better. So how I want this to work is our initial hero text is going to fade out as we start scrolling down, and the text in sections 1 and 2 is going to fade in. So we need to set the initial opacity of the text in sections 1 and 2 to 0 so it starts off invisible. So let's locate that. I believe it's this div here should work. So we'll do opacity 0, and then down in section 2 on text 3, let's set opacity 0 as well. And then in our scene, I've actually already gone ahead and coded up the animation as well. Because really, a lot of it's the same, but I'm going to walk through the differences right now. So like before, I've imported GSAP and the scroll trigger plugin, and I registered that plugin at the top of our scene file here. Now what's different is that we still have our use effect, but we're now operating on these HTML elements. Now, one difference between the effect in our MacBook versus the one in the scene here is that we're now animating HTML elements. So rather than using these references that we get of our meshes in the group here, our references are just these HTML elements. So we can easily get those by using getElementById and then referencing of course, the ID of the element. And then we just check to see that they're not null. And really, it's much of the same thing. So I have 3 separate timelines here. One that gets triggered off of section 1 scrolling. And it's slightly different than this one down here, but this one is also section 1. And then we have another trigger occurring off of section 2. So this one is controlling text 3. This one is controlling text 2. And this one is controlling text 1. So there's some differences in the start and end conditions here. So let's talk about that. So our trigger's off of section 1. So when the top of section 1 reaches the bottom of the screen, that's when we're starting the animation. And then when the midway point in that section reaches the bottom of the screen, then we're ending the animation. So let's take a quick look and see what that looks like. Now I'm going to grab the scroll bar here to have a bit more control. So as I scroll down, the animation is now starting. And then we can see that as the midway point reaches the bottom of the screen, then that text starts to fade out. Now I could set this to something else. Let's try 10%. And now as I scroll, we can see that the text fades out much more quickly. So that might actually be a bit of a better look, so we don't have the MacBook overlapping the text. And let's look at our other 2 timelines, triggering off of section 1 again. So when the top of section 1 reaches 50% of the screen height, then we are starting the animation. And when the top of section 1 reaches the top of the screen, then we're ending the animation. So it's kind of starting off, let's see, right about here. So you can see that the text is just starting to fade in right as the top of this red section hits the halfway point on the screen. And then when it gets all the way to the top, we have full opacity. And then we're doing the same kind of thing for section 2 as well. The animation is starting around the halfway point on the screen, and then it fades in as the section hits the top of the screen. So let's clean this up a bit. Let's get rid of these axes helper. Let's get rid of these colors that we don't want. And look at our final product here. Almost final product. There's one more thing we need to do. And then on our page, let's go to the section here, remove the background color, and remove this background color. All right, so our final animation, we scroll down, the text fades out, laptop falls down, has a little rotate around, opens up, then slides over to the left, and the other text fades in. So one final bit of polish I wanted to add on to this is adding in some shadows. Now shadows really help elevate a 3D application. They give a sense of grounding. Right now it looks like our laptop is just kind of floating in the air. It looks good, but it'll look a lot better with shadows, trust me. So let's go to our scene. And we're going to add something called contact shadows from the dry library. So without any configuration, we don't really see any shadows at all. So one of the first things that we need to do is we need to set the position of the shadows. So we'll set the position property equal to 0, -0.9, and 0. And now you can see that there's a shadow plane sitting beneath our laptop. So as we scroll down, we can see that shadow's starting to get a bit darker. Now it looks like we're hitting some issues here with our model rotating into the shadow, so we'll have to fix that. but it looks like our shadow's a little too dark. So let's go and set the opacity to 0.3. So that looks a bit better, not quite so stark. So let's see about fixing that rotation issue. So after playing around with this a bit, it looks like the rotation that I have here is just over-rotating the laptop a bit. So we need to set this to 0 instead. Now when I do the scroll, you can see that the laptop doesn't cut into that shadow. It looks much better. So that's it for this tutorial. If you have ideas for other tutorials that you'd like to see, please leave a comment below and let me know, whether it be Three.js, React 3 Fiber, or anything related to the 3D web. If you've enjoyed this tutorial, please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really means a lot, and you get some really cool perks, like being able to join my private Discord server and talk to me one-on-one. If you're interested in more tutorials like this, be sure to check out my Three.js crash course where I show you how to make a 3D art/project gallery. Now that one is just JavaScript, not React, so you'll learn a bit more of the fundamentals of Three.js. So until next time, thanks for watching. Take care, everyone.